Well, if the repeated highs in the market every day aren't giving it away, investors are increasingly bullish on stocks and on the global economy. That is the finding of the new UBS Investor Sentiment Survey, which now says 60% of global investors feel optimistic. And here in the U.S., it's even higher. It's 68% are optimistic. And here to talk about it is Michael Crook. He is head of America's investment strategy at UBS Global Wealth Management. Hi, Michael.
Hi, Dan.
So let's talk about the survey because there are a number of headwinds, concerns. We talk about trade still, even though we have a phase one deal. We talk about the election in 2020 coming, and yet the markets every day have just shrugged it off. Even right now, the coronavirus, which is a concern. Right. Now we're talking hyper recent news, but markets have seemed to just chug along anyway.
Well, you might start by questioning the direction of that causality. Markets were up in the U.S. 30% last year, so investors are now bullish. Maybe it's not surprising that they're a little more encouraged than they were 6 months ago, a year ago, after we'd gone through a difficult period. But I think what we're seeing right now is they're telling us some of the risks that we had a year ago are not as large, or they don't loom as large. Political risks, trade risks, certain policy risks that they were worried about have dissipated at least a bit.
How does this stack up against maybe some of the emerging markets? Because we talk about the fact that even though things are very strong here overseas, it's a slightly different story. There's still fears of a global economic slowdown. So how does that play into their responses?
It's similar. They're not as optimistic outside of the U.S. in a lot of regions that we look at, but they're still optimistic overall. And I think a big part of that is, take trade, for instance. Trade policy has a big impact on China, has a big impact on the rest of emerging markets and on the U.S. Investors everywhere are feeling better about trade today than they were just 6 months ago.
I wonder, too, if we can kind of zero in on the political risk, whether the election might change things or if it should just be status quo. I think here in the U.S., we've heard a lot of analysts come through and say the only thing that could slow down the markets is if Elizabeth Warren is elected because of her view on big corporations. I'm not sure I necessarily buy that. I'm making it clear I don't necessarily buy that. But, and then if it's a Trump re-election, people generally expect stocks to continue to do well. Do you think there's been kind of too much made of the impact of the 2020 election on stocks?
I think investors are concerned. What we see right now is ebb and flow in terms of the concern around the election. And it really depends on who's leading in the primaries or in the current polling. It's too soon to know in terms of exactly how concerned investors should be. But what's clear is that they tell us that is their main concern. And it's not only in the U.S. Investors virtually in every region say domestic politics are what they're mainly concerned about. So this is an issue here in the U.S., but it's also an issue in Europe and around the rest of the world, too.
What's also interesting is their responses, and they think that China will overtake the U.S. as the world's biggest superpower. 57% saying that will be the case by 2030. Is there any risk, do you think, to that?
Certainly we're in a world where economic growth is more dispersed than it used to be. But on the flip side, what we've seen is, from a globalization standpoint, is really we've hit peak globalization. And so we don't expect that trend to continue even more strongly like it has over the last 20 years. But that does change the face of geopolitics and really how we have to think about allies across the world. And it certainly has an impact both on business owners in the U.S., but also a lot of the investors that we work with overseas.
And talking about geopolitics, we were just discussing Christine Lagarde's comments on Brexit. If we zero in on Brexit, what are the possible implications there if that either goes smoothly, supposedly it will, doesn't go smoothly, ends up being a hard Brexit?
Yes. So Brexit seems like one of these risks that's gone back and forth for a couple of years now, at least.
It's been
dizzying. And what we would say right now is it's not something investors, particularly in the U.S., should be overly concerned with in terms of the broader impact. Honestly, when we look at risks across the globe, we put out a publication called Risk Watch. And one thing to know about Risk Watch is once a risk is on there, it's a known risk, right? And you can manage it. Brexit's been on there for a long time. And a lot of the big concerns that were on that, part of that publication a year ago, have really declined. And so that's, I think, goes back to this investor sentiment issue. They can at least see the light at the end of the tunnel.
And also what's interesting, just speaking of the risk, the top U.S. business concerns, cybersecurity was 52%, rising healthcare costs 52%, and taxes was 51%, which I was a little surprised about.
I think taxes goes back to policy in terms of political issues. Healthcare is an issue, mainly because of demographics. Right. Baby boomers are about midway through retirement, and they certainly have to think about how healthcare will impact their retirement plans. And cybersecurity, it's a big wild card for everyone, but there's so much uncertainty in terms of, I think, from an individual basis, how we protect ourselves from a cyber standpoint, but then also cyber warfare and some of these other issues that are effectively unknowns right now.
All right, Michael Crook of UBS, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Hey investors, Zach Guzman here. Are you interested in learning more about the markets and getting the latest financial news? Well, then click right here to subscribe to our Yahoo Finance YouTube channel. Get the latest up-to-the-minute market analysis, big interviews in the world of finance, and information on how to manage your money every day wherever you are.